In the icy expanse of the Rocky Mountains, Virgil McCrae Tanner's cabin stood as a symbol of defiance. Its strange, rotating roof met with laughter from his fellow trappers. But as the bitter winter pressed on, Virgil's creation would prove them all wrong, keeping his cabin a steady 67 degrees warmer than anything they had ever built. Before we dive deeper into Virgil's extraordinary story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're captivated by tales of survival and invention like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode promises even more astonishing frontier ingenuity. The wind howled down from the mountain passes, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. At the edge of the wilderness, Virgil McCrae Tanner stood by his cabin, looking out over the snow-covered plains with a steady gaze. The other trappers had gathered around their own makeshift camps, laughing and sharing stories of the harsh season ahead. But Virgil's cabin wasn't like theirs. Where their structures were simple log cabins, stacked hastily with notched corners and crude roofs, Virgil's was a marvel of strange construction. The walls of his cabin were sturdy, made from dark, irregular stones that had been carefully chosen for their strength. But it was the roof that drew the most attention. Unlike the static roofs of the other cabins, Virgil had designed his to rotate, a roof that could follow the sun, shifting with the arc of daylight to capture every ray of warmth. To the other trappers, this was absurd. Who needed such a contraption in the middle of the wilderness? It seemed like a waste of time and resources when a simple roof would suffice. They laughed at Virgil's vision, calling him a dreamer, mocking him for building a cabin that looked more like a strange tower than a proper shelter. "McCrae, you're wasting your time," said Jonah Hickman, a burly trapper from the neighboring valley. He slapped Virgil on the back with a loud laugh. "What good is a roof that turns? A cabin's supposed to keep the wind out, not chase the sun around like a fool." Virgil didn't respond to the mockery. He had heard it all before, but he knew that his design was more than just a roof. It was a solution to the very real problem of surviving the fierce mountain winters. He had seen too many men suffer, too many cabins that were ill-equipped to handle the freezing nights and the constant barrage of wind and snow. This rotating roof was a gamble, a desperate attempt to survive, and he was willing to face the ridicule if it meant a chance at something better. The cold wind cut through the mountains like a knife, but inside Virgil's cabin, it was different. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, its warmth dancing across the room. The stone walls held the heat from the fire, and the roof, slowly turning to follow the sun's last rays of light, began to warm the room even further. It wasn't much yet, just a slight increase in temperature, but it was enough to keep the chill at bay. The trappers outside, hunched over their fires and wrapped in thick coats, could feel the cold creeping into their bones despite the warmth of their own hearths. They didn't understand what Virgil had built. They didn't see the value of his innovation, but Virgil knew. He had tested the roof in the early days of autumn, before the snow fell, adjusting it carefully to follow the sun. Now, as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, he could see the results. The roof was keeping his cabin warmer, inch by inch. Inside his cabin, the warmth wrapped around Virgil like a comforting blanket, a small but significant victory. He glanced up at the roof, watching the way it slowly rotated, turning to catch the last light of the day. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, Virgil was safe, warm and content in a way the other trappers could never understand. It wasn't just about the warmth. It was about proving them wrong. The trappers could mock his cabin all they wanted, but Virgil McCrae Tanner knew one thing for sure. His creation was going to change the way people thought about survival in the Rockies. And when the next storm came, he would be ready. The sun barely touched the horizon as the first snowstorm of winter swept across the Rocky Mountains. Virgil McCrae Tanner watched it from the warmth of his cabin, the cold wind rattling against the walls outside. He stepped to the window and looked out over the snow-covered plains where his fellow trappers had set up their camps. Their cabins, made of hastily notched logs and simple roofs, looked sturdy enough from a distance, but he knew better. They were not designed to endure the biting cold that would soon descend upon them. Virgil's cabin, with its rotating roof, was a strange sight in the eyes of the other trappers. They had laughed when he first started building it, ridiculing his choice to use such a peculiar design. They didn't understand the mechanics of it, and they certainly didn't believe it would hold up against the brutal winter. But Virgil knew that his rotating roof was more than just an oddity, it was a survival tool. As the sun dipped lower in the sky each day, the temperature would plummet, and without proper warmth, even the toughest of men could freeze. The others might rely on their simple, familiar construction, but Virgil had a plan. The rotating roof, which followed the sun's path across the sky, was designed to capture every ounce of heat the sun could offer. In this desolate, snow-covered land, that heat could mean the difference between life and death. If his calculations were right, the cabin would stay warmer for longer than any other shelter in the mountains. Outside, the snowstorm picked up, the wind howled, and the snowflakes whipped through the air, driven by the harsh gusts. Virgil adjusted the mechanism on his roof, ensuring it was aligned just right to catch the last of the fading sunlight. As he did, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His invention was not just a vanity project, it was a lifeline. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire flickered, and Virgil could feel the heat being retained by the thick stone walls. The fire crackled, but it was the rotating roof that made the difference. It wasn't just a roof that could follow the sun, it was a mechanism that could turn a life-threatening environment into a manageable one. Virgil knew it wasn't perfect, but it was something none of the other trappers had. The others would learn soon enough. As the storm raged outside, Virgil felt an undeniable confidence that his cabin would stand strong against the winter's fury. He had made it through many harsh winters, but this time he was prepared. He was warm. And if the others ever wanted to understand, they would have to see for themselves. The temperature outside dropped sharply, and the wind howled louder. But inside Virgil's cabin, the warmth of the fire and the sun's last rays from the rotating roof kept the chill at bay. No matter how bad the storm got, Virgil knew one thing for sure. He would survive this winter, and the others would soon realize that he had built more than just a shelter. He had built a future. The first heavy snowfall arrived just after the new year. The winds howled through the mountain passes, and the once clear sky was swallowed by swirling clouds of white. Virgil McCrae Tanner sat in his cabin, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the snow began to fall in thick sheets. He adjusted the mechanism on the rotating roof one final time, ensuring it would follow the sun's path even as it dipped lower in the sky with each passing day. Outside, the other trappers huddled around their fires, making the best of the storm. But Virgil knew their cabins wouldn't hold up. They were built hastily and without thought for the coming winter's ferocity. The logs were stacked, but the gaps between them left space for drafts to creep in, and their roofs, simple as they were, wouldn't be able to handle the weight of the snow that would soon blanket everything. As the storm intensified, Virgil's cabin remained remarkably calm. Inside, the warmth from the fire felt more potent than it ever had before. The rotating roof did its work, aligning itself to catch the fleeting rays of sunlight whenever possible. It was the small victories that Virgil treasured now, the moments when his design proved itself in the face of nature's most brutal challenges. The wind outside moaned, but inside the temperature held steady. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Virgil felt the heat radiating from the stone walls, a warmth unlike any he had experienced in the cabins of other trappers. While the men outside fought to keep their fires alive, he sat in the comfort of his creation, watching the snow drift by. It wasn't perfect, the warmth wasn't constant yet, but it was enough to keep the chill away. Virgil knew that this was only the beginning. His invention was going to change everything. The rotating roof, with its ability to follow the sun and capture heat, had the potential to revolutionize cabin building in the Rocky Mountains. Despite the storm raging outside, Virgil allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. He had built something that worked. While the other trappers struggled to stay warm, he was already ahead of the game. The storm would pass, but his cabin would remain a testament to his perseverance and ingenuity. He glanced toward the window, where the last rays of sunlight were beginning to fade. The rotating roof was doing its job, capturing every last bit of warmth from the sun before it set. Outside, the winds howled and the snow continued to fall, but inside, Virgil felt a quiet certainty. His cabin would endure this storm and any others that came his way. He had built something far stronger than simple logs and stone. He had built survival itself. The storm raged for days, sweeping through the mountain range like a furious beast. Inside his cabin, Virgil McCrae Tanner watched the snow pile up against the stone walls, but inside the temperature remained steady. The fire in the hearth crackled, sending a warm glow across the room. Virgil adjusted the mechanism on the rotating roof, watching as the slats of wood slowly turned, tracking the sun's movement. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a difference. The temperature outside plummeted to well below freezing. Yet inside, Virgil could feel the heat gathering around him, a subtle comfort. As the days passed, the snow continued to fall, but the cabin felt almost inviting. While the other trappers struggled to keep their fires going, he was warm and secure. Every few hours, Virgil would adjust the roof, ensuring it stayed in line with the sun. He had spent months perfecting this design, and now he could see it paying off. The roof, slowly rotating, was harnessing every possible ray of sunlight, keeping the cabin just warm enough to stave off the cold. Outside, the other trappers were bundled up tightly in their coats, their faces drawn with fatigue from battling the storm. They hadn't even noticed that Virgil's cabin remained untouched by the storm. The windows glowed softly in the fading light, and the warm air inside seemed to defy the fierce winds howling outside. Virgil felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't building his cabin for recognition or praise. He was building it to survive. The other men didn't understand. They still saw his rotating roof as an oddity, a waste of effort. But Virgil knew that what he had created was something truly special. He stood at the window, gazing out over the frozen landscape. The storm had covered the plains in a blanket of white, but inside his cabin he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The temperature was not unbearable, and the warmth radiating from the fire was the proof he needed. The rotating roof was working, slowly but surely. It was providing a better, more sustainable way to survive the harsh winters of the Rockies. The cold was relentless outside, but Virgil knew that the storm would pass and his cabin would stand tall. In the end, it wasn't just about building a shelter. It was about building something that could withstand the unforgiving wilderness. And Virgil McCrae Tanner had done just that. As the winter deepened, the other trappers grew restless. Their own cabins, though sturdy enough, offered little comfort against the relentless cold. The fire inside couldn't warm the walls fast enough, and the cold drafts seeped in from the cracks in their cabins. But they weren't the only ones affected by the worsening conditions. Virgil McCrae Tanner's reputation, which had once been the subject of ridicule, was starting to shift. The men who had laughed at him for his rotating roof now found themselves staring at his cabin in disbelief, seeing the warm light through the window while their own fires barely held off the cold. They had thought Virgil foolish, but now they were beginning to wonder if there was something to his invention. One evening, as Virgil sat by the fire, Jonah Hickman approached him, his coat heavy with snow. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin felt almost like spring. "McCrae," Hickman grumbled, "how's that ridiculous roof of yours holding up? Keeping the whole cabin warm, I suppose?" Virgil didn't look up immediately, his focus on the fire. "It's doing what it was built to do," he replied evenly. Hickman snorted, though there was no real humor in his voice. "I can't believe you've got us all beat with that thing. It's just wood and stone. Doesn't make sense." Virgil turned to face him, his eyes calm but firm. "It's not just wood and stone, Hickman. It's a solution to a problem that's been killing men for years. You'll see." The words hung in the air, and Hickman shifted uncomfortably, as if the weight of them had reached him. Virgil wasn't about to apologize for his invention, nor would he allow anyone to make light of what he had built. The men outside had their way of doing things, their tried and true methods, but Virgil's cabin had already withstood more than they ever could. Though the storm still raged, the cabin stayed warm, the rotating roof following the sun as it dropped lower on the horizon. The others had mocked him, but Virgil knew his cabin was more than just a structure. It was proof that innovation could thrive even in the harshest conditions. As Hickman turned to leave, his voice trailed behind him. "Well, I won't admit it yet, but I'm curious to see if that roof of yours actually keeps working." Virgil watched him go, his expression unreadable. It was no longer about proving anyone wrong. It was about surviving the winter, and as long as his rotating roof continued to do its job, he knew he was one step ahead of the rest. The howling winds outside shook the cabin, rattling the stone walls. Virgil McCrae Tanner stood by the fire, staring into the crackling flames as the storm raged on. The rotating roof had proven itself time and time again, keeping the cabin warm, even as the temperature outside plummeted. But tonight, something was different. A quiet unease gnawed at him. He'd spent so much time perfecting the design, ensuring the roof rotated smoothly and captured every scrap of sunlight that filtered through the thick clouds. Yet, despite the warmth the cabin held, doubts began creeping into his mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if the storm that seemed to intensify by the hour would break the roof, rendering it useless? What if his invention wasn't the solution he'd hoped for? Virgil turned away from the fire and glanced toward the roof's rotating mechanism, now slowly shifting with the little sunlight that managed to break through the clouds. The cabin felt warm enough, but his mind raced with worst-case scenarios. A small part of him wondered if the other trappers were right after all. Maybe he had wasted too much time building something that might not be enough to withstand nature's fury. Outside, the storm whipped the snow in every direction, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the next few hours would test everything he had built. He had already lost too much in the mountains. Too many good men, too many tragedies. The wilderness didn't forgive mistakes, and he was starting to wonder if his cabin, despite its ingenuity, was still too fragile to survive the brutal winter ahead. He walked toward the small window, his breath fogging up the glass. Through the haze, he could just make out the other trappers' cabins, dark silhouettes against the swirling snow. He knew they were struggling. He could hear their complaints even through the storm. Their fires, though burning, couldn't hold a candle to the warmth he had inside his cabin. But the doubt still lingered. What if, despite all the planning and adjustments, his rotating roof wasn't enough to keep him safe? The men outside could laugh all they wanted, but what if his invention was doomed to fail, just like every other attempt at surviving in the wilderness? Virgil ran his hand through his beard and let out a long sigh. He knew there was no going back now. His cabin was all he had left, and no matter how much uncertainty gnawed at him, he would stay and see it through. He had come too far to turn back. As the storm raged, he knew one thing for sure. If his cabin didn't hold up, he would face the consequences alone, but he had to believe it would. The fire flickered, casting shadows on the walls, and the warmth slowly began to ease his mind. Doubts would come, but Virgil had always learned to keep moving forward, no matter the fear that clung to his heart. Days passed, and the storm finally began to subside, leaving the mountains blanketed in thick snow. The wind, still sharp and biting, swept through the valley, but inside his cabin, Virgil felt a renewed sense of confidence. The fire in the hearth crackled steadily, casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the cold world outside. Virgil had been adjusting the rotating roof all throughout the storm, carefully following the path of the sun as it fought to break through the heavy clouds. Despite his earlier doubts, the roof had held up, and the cabin remained warmer than anything the other trappers had. But he knew this was just the beginning. The real test would come when the storm had passed and the cold truly set in. He stepped outside and felt the sharp sting of the cold air on his face. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he surveyed the other cabins. Some were partially buried by the snow, their roofs sagging under the weight. Others were barely visible through the drifts. Virgil knew that most of them wouldn't survive the full winter without major repairs. Their construction, though sufficient for the moment, lacked the long-term durability needed for such harsh conditions. Virgil's cabin, on the other hand, stood strong, its walls firm and the rotating roof still functioning as it should. It had proven itself during the worst of the storm, and now it was time to see if it could endure the bitter cold that would follow. He returned to the cabin and adjusted the roof again, this time focusing on maximizing the heat retention as the sun dipped lower. The warmth in the room seemed to multiply, and for the first time in days, he felt the full weight of the achievement. Inside, the temperature held steady at a comfortable level. The fire didn't have to work as hard to maintain the warmth, and the roof seemed to be doing its part, catching every scrap of sunlight. He could feel the difference as he moved around the room. The stone walls absorbed the heat, and the air, though crisp, was not unbearable. It was clear to Virgil now. The cabin was working. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the warmth from the rotating roof lingered longer than he expected. The night would be cold, but the cabin had already proved it could handle whatever nature threw at it. The storm had tested his invention, and it had held up. The other trappers might not admit it, but Virgil knew his cabin was not just surviving the elements, it was thriving. The cold winds howled outside, but inside, Virgil McCrae Tanner felt the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. His invention had passed the test. It was more than just a shelter. It was proof that innovation could overcome even the harshest conditions. The storm had passed, but the mountain air remained bitterly cold. Virgil McCrae Tanner stood at the window of his cabin, watching as the sun began to dip behind the distant peaks. The wind had finally begun to lose its ferocity, but the snow still clung to the earth in heavy drifts. The world outside was quiet now, save for the occasional rustling of the trees in the wind. Inside his cabin, however, it was warm, far warmer than anything the other trappers had managed. Virgil had been adjusting the rotating roof throughout the day, ensuring it remained aligned with the sun's descent. The warmth that gathered in the cabin was palpable, seeping into the walls, into every corner. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it wasn't the only source of heat. The roof was doing its job, following the sun's arc as it had been designed to, and capturing every ounce of heat it could. The other trappers, camped out in their own cabins, had been struggling with their fires. Virgil could hear their complaints carried on the wind, the occasional shout or curse as they battled the cold. They hadn't noticed the warmth that radiated from Virgil's cabin, but the glow from his window caught their attention. Through the snow and the trees, they saw the light, steady and constant, emanating from the stone walls of his cabin. Virgil had been alone for days, the isolation of the storm offering him time to reflect. Yet as he stood there, gazing out over the frozen landscape, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had built something that worked. It was a quiet victory, one that didn't require recognition or applause. His cabin was warm, it was safe, and it had held up during the worst of the storm. He couldn't help but think back to the days when the other trappers had mocked him. They had ridiculed his cabin, his rotating roof, and the time he had spent building it. They had seen it as an oddity, a waste of resources. But now, after the storm had passed, Virgil knew the truth. His invention had done what their simple structures couldn't. The cold still clung to their cabins, their fires flickering and barely holding against the chill. Meanwhile, his cabin stood resilient, warm, and secure. The silence in his cabin was broken by a knock on the door. Virgil hesitated for a moment, then moved toward it. He opened the door to find Jonah Hickman standing there, his face red from the cold and his coat caked with snow. "McCrae," Hickman said, his voice rough from the wind. "I got to admit it. Your roof, it's working. I've been watching from my cabin. Your cabin's the only one still standing strong in this storm." Virgil said nothing at first, just nodded slowly. Hickman stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the interior of the cabin. The warmth, the quiet, and the security of it all were undeniable. "I'll be damned," Hickman muttered, stepping back. "You might just have made something that'll change the way we build out here." Virgil's lips curled into a faint smile, but he didn't speak. There was nothing left to prove. The cold outside was unforgiving, but inside his cabin he knew he had found something better than survival. He had found a way to thrive in the wilderness. As the days passed, the other trappers began to take notice. Virgil. McCrae Tanner had been the subject of ridicule for so long, his cabin dismissed as nothing more than a curious oddity. But as the winter continued, they couldn't deny it any longer. His rotating roof was not only keeping his cabin warm, it was standing up to the brutal conditions that had claimed many of their own shelters. Virgil had always been a solitary man, driven by a quiet determination. But now, as he moved through the snow-covered valley, he could feel the shift. The other trappers, once eager to mock his creation, were beginning to see the value in it. They stopped by his cabin, their skepticism replaced by curiosity. One afternoon, as Virgil worked outside, hauling wood for the fire, he heard the crunch of boots in the snow. He turned to see a figure approaching. It was Edgar Montgomery, a trapper from a neighboring camp. Edgar had been one of the most vocal critics of Virgil's design. "McCrae," Edgar called, his voice rough from the cold. "Got a minute?" Virgil nodded, wiping his hands on his coat. "What's on your mind?" "I've been watching your cabin." "I'll admit it, I was wrong. That roof of yours, it's keeping you warm, isn't it?" Virgil didn't answer right away, but his expression softened. "It is." Edgar glanced over at the cabin, then back at Virgil. "How does it work? I mean, I thought it was just a gimmick, but now I'm thinking it's something else." Virgil studied him for a moment before speaking. "It tracks the sun, changes position to catch the light, and holds on to the heat. Keeps the cold out better than any cabin I've seen." Edgar nodded, looking thoughtful. "I can see that now. I've had a hell of a time keeping my place warm. Maybe we need to start thinking about this differently." Virgil smiled, though it was a quiet, knowing smile. He had never expected praise or acknowledgement from the other trappers. His cabin was for survival, not approval. But the change in their attitudes was unmistakable. They were starting to see the value in his invention. Over the next few weeks, more and more trappers visited Virgil's cabin, asking questions, taking notes, and wondering if they, too, could adapt the rotating roof design to their own homes. Virgil didn't mind the visitors. He had never been one to seek attention, but if they were willing to learn, he was more than happy to share. His cabin was no longer just a personal refuge. It was a lesson in survival, an idea whose time had come. By the time spring arrived, Virgil McCrae Tanner had become a quiet legend among the trappers of the Rockies. The harsh winter was finally behind them, but the lessons learned in those brutal months would not soon be forgotten. Virgil's cabin, with its rotating roof, had stood firm against the worst storms the mountains could muster. And now, other trappers were beginning to realize the true value of his design. One by one they approached him, some with reluctance, others with excitement. They had watched his cabin survive while theirs had faltered. They had felt the warmth that had come from his invention and knew that they too would need something like it to endure the coming winters. It started with small questions. How does the roof turn? What kind of wood did you use? But as the spring thaw gave way to summer's heat, the questions grew more specific. Virgil, who had once worked in isolation, now found himself teaching others. He showed them how the rotating mechanism worked, how to position the roof to catch the sun's warmth, how to build the sturdy stone walls that could withstand the harshest conditions. At first it was just a few curious trappers here and there asking for advice. But word spread quickly. Virgil's reputation shifted from that of a foolish dreamer to a man who had created something worth learning. It wasn't long before men from far-flung camps made their way to his cabin, eager to learn about his design. Even those who had once mocked him were now quietly studying the principles he had used to build his shelter. The attention was both flattering and overwhelming. Virgil had never sought out the praise of others, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction that came with seeing his ideas take root. He watched as the men who had once laughed at him began to implement his techniques. Slowly, the cabins in the surrounding camps began to change. Log roofs gave way to rotating designs and stone walls were built to last. Virgil took a quiet pride in knowing that his invention was helping others. He had built something that not only kept him safe, but was now providing the same protection to others. The Rocky Mountains were unforgiving, and survival was a constant struggle. But with each new cabin that incorporated his roof design, the community grew stronger, more resilient. By the time the first frost of the following autumn arrived, several cabins in the valley had adopted Virgil's rotating roof. The men who had laughed at him now understood, and though they didn't all give credit where it was due, they knew that Virgil McCrae Tanner's ingenuity had changed the way they thought about shelter in the wilderness. For Virgil, it was enough. He hadn't built his cabin for recognition. He had built it to survive. But in the process, he had changed the lives of others, and that to him was the truest measure of success. The fall of 1842 had brought with it a harsh reminder of the wilderness's brutal power. The weather had turned quickly, and as the first snow of the season fell, Virgil McCrae Tanner found himself preparing for another long winter. He had spent the last few years refining his cabin, adding small improvements here and there, but the rotating roof had already proven itself. There was no question now about its worth. Yet, as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Virgil received an unexpected visit. A trapper named William Marshall, who had a small cabin about 12 miles away, arrived at his doorstep looking weary and worn. His face was pale, his breath labored as he stepped into the warmth of Virgil's cabin. "McCrae," William said, his voice shaky, "I've got a problem, a big one." Virgil closed the door behind him and gestured for William to sit. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling in the hearth. It was a comfort Virgil often took for granted, but seeing the exhaustion in William's eyes made him realize just how crucial that warmth could be in the mountain wilderness. "What's happened?" Virgil asked, offering William a drink. William took the cup, his hands trembling as he spoke. "I had a bear try to get into my cabin last night. I've seen them around before, but this one was different. It tore right through my door. By the time I made it to the loft, it had destroyed most of my supplies. I barely got out with my life." Virgil listened intently, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. He knew the dangers of the mountains better than most. A bear could ruin everything in a matter of minutes, and William's cabin, like so many others, wasn't built to withstand such an attack. "I need help," William continued, his voice tight. "I don't have the resources to rebuild, and winter's already setting in. Your cabin, it's built to last. Can you help me?" Virgil stood up, his mind already turning. He didn't hesitate. "I'll come with you. We'll get that cabin fixed, and I'll show you how to reinforce it. We can't afford to have another attack." Virgil knew that William's situation was dire, but he also saw it as an opportunity. It was one thing to teach others about his rotating roof, but it was another to help them build it for real, to make sure it was done right. This was a chance to prove that his cabin design wasn't just an oddity. It was a solution to a problem that could save lives. Together, they would rebuild, and William's cabin would be stronger for it. And Virgil would be reminded, once again, that survival in the wilderness wasn't just about one man's effort. It was about the strength of the community and the willingness to help each other in the face of nature's most unforgiving challenges. The first light of dawn filtered through the heavy snow clouds, casting a pale glow over the landscape. Virgil McCrae Tanner stood at the edge of William Marshall's cabin, taking in the destruction. The door, torn from its hinges, lay in splintered ruins. A few steps away, the corner of the cabin had been ripped open, the logs scattered across the ground. It wasn't just the damage to the cabin itself. It was the loss of supplies, the food, and equipment that would make the coming winter unbearable without repairs. Virgil knew the harsh reality of the mountains. A bear attack could destroy months of hard work in minutes. William had already set to work clearing the debris, his face pale and drawn from the ordeal. Virgil walked over to him, a steady resolve in his step. "We'll get it fixed," Virgil said it. His voice calm despite the enormity of the task before them. William nodded gratefully but said nothing. He was too exhausted, too shaken by the attack to speak much. Virgil had seen the same look in the eyes of trappers who had survived bear encounters before. They were haunted by the sheer force of nature that could take everything from them without warning. The fact that William had survived it all was a testament to his own resilience. Virgil spent the next several hours carefully assessing the damage. The door would need to be completely replaced, and the corner logs had to be reinforced. Fortunately, Virgil had learned the hard way how to make cabins more secure. He began to show William how to strengthen the structure, starting with the door. "You need to build it like a wall," Virgil explained, as he demonstrated the technique he'd used in his own cabin, using reinforced joints and strong iron brackets. As they worked, Virgil shared what he had learned over the years: how to make a cabin less vulnerable to attack, how to reinforce the walls to resist the strength of a bear's claws, how to build a door that wouldn't easily break. William watched closely, his expression changing from one of doubt to quiet admiration. "You're telling me your cabin's never been attacked?" William asked, still skeptical, but beginning to understand. "Never," Virgil said with a quiet confidence. "That's because I built it to withstand it." It was slow, difficult work, but by the end of the day the cabin's corner had been reinforced and the door was beginning to take shape. The two men stood back, looking at their progress. It wasn't a finished job, but it was a start. "Thank you," William said finally, his voice thick with gratitude. "I never would have thought to build it like this." Virgil nodded. "It's not about thinking, it's about learning from the past. We survive by adapting." That night, as they sat by the fire inside the cabin, Virgil couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. This wasn't just about building a better shelter, it was about building trust. William had come to him for help, and together they were making his cabin stronger. Virgil had never been one for fame or glory, but seeing others learn from his work felt like its own kind of reward. The wilderness was harsh and unforgiving, but with every lesson passed on, with every cabin built stronger than before, Virgil knew that survival was no longer just about individual effort. It was about a shared understanding, a community that learned from one another, and that knowledge would be passed on for generations. As winter settled deeper into the mountains, a sense of transformation swept through the trapping community. What had once been a solitary invention of Virgil McCrae Tanner's was now spreading across the valley. One by one, the trappers began adapting their cabins, incorporating Virgil's rotating roof design, seeing the logic in it where they had once seen only absurdity. It started with a few men visiting Virgil's cabin, watching how the roof turned with the sun's arc, how the warmth inside never seemed to falter, even as the temperatures outside plunged. Those who had previously scoffed at him now stood in silence, their eyes studying the design with a new respect. One of the first to implement the idea was Edgar Montgomery, a trapper who had once dismissed Virgil's design as impractical. After seeing the results firsthand, he began to rebuild his own cabin. "I'm giving it a try," he said when he visited Virgil for advice. "What's the worst that could happen?" Virgil gave a simple nod. "You won't regret it." It was a slow and labor-intensive process, but Edgar worked steadily, carefully following the guidelines Virgil had set. Over the course of several weeks, the roof of Edgar's cabin was transformed, made to rotate and capture every possible ray of sunlight. As the days grew colder, Edgar's cabin stayed warm, far warmer than it ever had in previous winters. The other trappers watched from afar, their curiosity piqued. They had been hesitant to adopt something so radically different. But now they saw it wasn't just an invention for Virgil. It was a solution for everyone. The men who had once ridiculed him began to ask questions. How did the roof mechanism work? What kind of materials did they need? What were the exact measurements? Virgil, though never one to seek attention, began to feel a quiet satisfaction. He had never expected his invention to spread this far, but now that it was, he saw the value of his design in a new light. It wasn't just about warmth or survival anymore. It was about the strength of the community, the willingness to embrace new ideas and learn from one another. By the time the first snowstorm of the season arrived, a handful of cabins in the valley had incorporated Virgil's rotating roof. Though the other men had come to him with questions, now Virgil found himself seeking their advice, sharing the lessons they had all learned over the course of the harsh winter months. It wasn't just a matter of surviving anymore. It was a matter of thriving. And as the winds howled outside and the snow piled up against the cabins, Virgil McCrae Tanner knew that the future of the Rocky Mountains would be a little bit warmer for everyone. By the winter of 1843, the entire trapping community in the valley had begun to change. What had once been a solitary invention by Virgil McCrae Tanner, seen as an eccentric oddity, was now becoming a standard. More and more trappers were adopting his rotating roof design, learning from Virgil's innovation, and applying it to their own cabins. The cabin that had once been the subject of ridicule was now a model of ingenuity and survival. Virgil had always been a solitary man, preferring the quiet of his cabin and the peace of the wilderness. But now he found himself surrounded by others, each seeking his advice, his knowledge, and his expertise. It was a strange feeling. The quiet trapper who had once worked alone was now a mentor to those who had once mocked him. It wasn't just the rotating roof that had caught their attention. It was the entire design, the reinforced corners, the stone walls, the small but crucial details that Virgil had perfected over the years. His cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a fortress, a testament to the fact that survival in the harsh conditions of the Rockies required more than just brute strength. It required ingenuity, creativity, and a willingness to think outside the box. One by one, the trappers began to adopt Virgil's techniques. They rebuilt their cabins, reinforced their doors, and incorporated rotating roofs to keep their homes warm during the long winters. The community, once fragmented and competitive, began to come together as they shared ideas and resources, learning from one another in a way they had never done before. At first, Virgil was hesitant. He had never sought the spotlight, never craved attention for his work. But as he watched the changes in the community, the camaraderie that had begun to form, the shared understanding of what it took to survive, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. His invention had become more than just a tool for survival. It had become a symbol of collaboration, of a community that had come together in the face of adversity. The once rough edges of the mountain men softened as they shared knowledge and resources. The men who had once scoffed at Virgil now worked alongside him, learning from him and teaching him in return. The sense of rivalry that had defined the trapping community for so long began to fade, replaced by a mutual respect born out of the realization that survival was a team effort. Virgil knew that things would never be the same. His invention, once ridiculed, had changed the way the entire community viewed shelter and survival. The knowledge he had gained through years of trial and error was now shared freely among the trappers, strengthening their bonds and increasing their chances of survival. And for Virgil, that was the greatest reward of all. The first true test of the rotating roofs came in the early months of 1844, when a particularly fierce winter storm swept through the mountains, the kind of storm that had brought down trees, buried entire camps, and left men stranded without shelter. The winds howled through the valley, and the snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets, piling up against anything in its path. Virgil McCrae Tanner stood in his cabin, watching the storm rage outside. The temperature had dropped rapidly, and the wind had picked up, turning the snow into a blinding wall of white. He had already reinforced his cabin in preparation for the worst, and now it was time to see if his rotating roof could hold up against the most extreme conditions yet. It wasn't just Virgil's cabin at risk. The entire trapping community was vulnerable. Many of the cabins, even those with rotating roofs, hadn't been built to withstand the full force of a storm like this. The weight of the snow could break roofs, collapse walls, and destroy the fragile shelters the men had worked so hard to build. Virgil adjusted the mechanism on his roof, ensuring it was aligned to catch what little sunlight the storm allowed. He watched as the roof slowly rotated, capturing the weak rays and sending them into the cabin. The temperature inside held steady, the warmth from the fire mixing with the heat from the roof. His cabin was holding up, and he knew it wasn't just by luck. It was by design. As the storm continued to rage outside, Virgil could hear the faint sounds of other men calling to one another, shouting through the wind and snow. He could feel the tension building in the valley as men rushed to secure their cabins and prepare for the worst. But inside his cabin, Virgil remained calm. The roof was doing its job, and the warmth was a comfort. The storm raged for days, but when it finally passed, Virgil knew the value of his design had been proven. His cabin, the first of its kind, had survived the most brutal storm of the season without so much as a crack in its walls or a weakness in its roof. The other cabins had fared less well. Several had collapsed under the weight of the snow, their roofs caving in and leaving the men trapped inside. As the men gathered to assess the damage, Virgil stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the others. They were exhausted, battered by the storm, but there was a new respect in their eyes. They had seen firsthand the power of the rotating roof, and though they didn't yet admit it, they knew that Virgil's cabin had withstood the storm because it was built with care, with ingenuity, and with a focus on survival that few others had understood. Virgil didn't need their praise. The proof was in the shelter itself. His invention had not only protected him, but had saved others as well. The storm had been the ultimate test, and it had proven the value of his design. And for Virgil, that was enough. As the winter of 1844 wore on, the wilderness grew harsher. The snow continued to fall relentlessly, and the winds howled with an unforgiving fury. Virgil McCrae Tanner had weathered many storms, but this season had been particularly brutal. The trappers' cabins, with their crude constructions and basic designs, struggled to hold up against the battering forces of nature. Many of the men found themselves trapped inside, unable to leave their homes for fear of collapsing roofs or dangerous snowdrifts. Virgil, however, had spent the last few months refining his cabin even further. The rotating roof was working better than ever, capturing every scrap of sunlight that filtered through the thick clouds. The stone walls, once simply a buffer against the wind, had become a nearly impenetrable defense against the cold. He had learned the hard way how to make every part of his cabin strong enough to survive the extreme conditions of the Rockies, and now he felt more prepared than ever. But it wasn't just his cabin that he had to worry about. The other trappers, many of whom had started adopting his techniques, were also facing the brutal realities of the season. As the storms continued to rage, Virgil's cabin remained a beacon of warmth and safety. He had seen firsthand the damage the snow could do to cabins built without care. Some had collapsed under the weight of the snow, while others had succumbed to the cold, their fires burning out before morning. One morning, as Virgil stepped outside to gather firewood, he noticed something unsettling. A large snowdrift had formed near the back of his cabin, and the weight of it was pressing against the walls. Virgil knew that if the snow continued to pile up, his cabin could be compromised. The rotating roof had kept the cabin warm, but it was time for another test. Could it hold up against the weight of the snow? With steady hands, Virgil adjusted the mechanism of the roof, watching it rotate as he ensured it was aligned properly to shed the accumulating snow. As the roof turned, the snow began to slide off, taking the weight off the structure. Inside, the warmth held steady, and the fire crackled in the hearth. He had designed the cabin to withstand more than just wind and cold. It was meant to survive the harshest storms the mountains could throw at it. As the snow continued to fall, Virgil knew this was the true test of survival. His cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a life-saving fortress. The rotating roof had proven itself time and again, and now, as the storm intensified, it would either break or stand strong. Virgil didn't doubt for a second that his cabin would survive. It was a product of years of hard work, trial, and error, and now, as the storm raged outside, he felt confident that his design would see him through. The winter of 1844 passed without the catastrophic storms that had earlier defined the season. The snow had been relentless, but Virgil McCrae Tanner's cabin held firm, a beacon of warmth amid the brutal conditions. The other trappers, many of whom had adopted his rotating roof design, found their cabins faring better than expected. They no longer feared the weight of snow or the biting cold as they had before. As the spring thaw began to break up the frozen landscape, Virgil found himself contemplating the journey that had led him to this point. His cabin, which had once been ridiculed, had become a symbol of survival, a lifeline for him and his fellow trappers. The rotating roof, simple yet revolutionary, had proven itself time and again. It had weathered the worst of the storms, and now it had become the standard, the design that everyone had to follow. Yet, for all the success and recognition, Virgil never sought glory. He was a man of quiet reflection, preferring solitude over the praise of others. His cabin was his sanctuary, a space built for survival, not recognition. He had spent years perfecting it, not for fame, but because he needed it to work. The fact that others had seen its value and adopted it felt like a natural progression, not an achievement. The trappers who had once mocked him for his outlandish design now came to him for advice. Some had even gone as far as to rebuild their cabins using his techniques, incorporating the rotating roof and the reinforced corners that had made his own home so durable. Virgil didn't mind sharing what he had learned over the years, but he never expected it to lead to widespread recognition. To him, the work had always been about survival, about ensuring that his cabin, and those of his neighbors, could withstand the unrelenting challenges of the wilderness. His cabin, standing strong and warm amid the harsh landscape, began to take on a mythic quality. Word spread quickly through the trapping community, and travelers passing through the region would stop to ask about the design. They marveled at the ingenuity of the rotating roof, wondering how Virgil had come up with the idea. Some wanted to replicate it, others simply admired its practicality. Despite his desire for solitude, Virgil found himself explaining his methods time and again. By the time Virgil decided to leave the mountains in 1846, his legacy was firmly planted. His cabin, with its innovative roof and durable structure, had influenced the designs of countless other shelters in the region. It had become a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Though Virgil never sought to be remembered, his invention ensured that he would be. His cabin stood as a testament to a man who, when faced with the brutal realities of life in the Rockies, found a way not just to survive, but to thrive. The rotating roof had been more than a solution. It was a piece of Virgil's spirit, enduring long after he left the wilderness behind. The years had passed, and Virgil McCrae Tanner's time in the Rockies was coming to an end. The mountains that had once felt like home now seemed distant, their cold and isolation not so welcoming. He had spent most of his life in the wilderness, building, adapting, and surviving. The rotating roof that had once been the subject of ridicule had become a vital part of mountain living, an innovation that had made survival in the Rockies a little bit more bearable. Now, in the year 1846, Virgil was preparing to leave the mountains behind. He had built a life here, one that had been defined by struggle and quiet success. But the time had come for him to move on. His work was done, and the cabin that had kept him safe and warm for so many years was now a symbol of his legacy. The rotating roof that had once seemed so ridiculous to his fellow trappers had become an indispensable part of mountain living, and with it, Virgil's impact had spread far beyond his own small cabin. He had taught others how to build stronger, safer homes, how to use simple but effective designs to withstand the harsh conditions of the Rocky Mountains. The once solitary trapper had become a mentor, a guide to those who sought to survive the wilds of the West. His quiet innovation had saved lives, and his legacy would live on in the cabins of those who had learned from him. As Virgil packed his belongings and prepared for the long journey south, he stood outside his cabin one last time, looking at the landscape that had defined his life. The sun was setting over the snow-covered peaks, casting a warm glow on the stone walls of his cabin. The rotating roof turned slowly with the last light of the day, just as it had done countless times before. The warmth inside was comforting, but Virgil knew it was time to move on. His thoughts wandered to the men he had met over the years, the ones who had shared his struggles, his victories, and his defeats. They had all learned to adapt in their own way, finding solutions to the many problems that came with living in the wilderness. Virgil had given them something that would help them survive, but he had also learned from them too. The community that had once mocked him had become a community that depended on him, and in turn Virgil had found a sense of belonging that had once seemed impossible. As he saddled his horse and looked back at the cabin one final time, Virgil felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had built something that would last, something that would continue to help others for years to come. The mountain man who had once been an outsider had left a lasting mark on the wilderness. Virgil McCrae Tanner rode into the sunset, leaving behind a legacy that would endure far beyond the mountains he had once called home.